And so I wrote letters all over the country to find a postdoc, and ultimately found one at Dartmouth, up in Hanover, New Hampshire, with a fellow by the name of Ross McIntyre, who was a hematologist, an oncologist, and had his claim to fame is that he was the second person that had discovered that if you added phytohemagglutinin, PHA, to lymphocyte cultures, that the lymphocytes would proliferate and undergo mitosis. And so I went up to interview up at Dartmouth, and of course we were down in Baltimore. And the other thing you have to remember is, and so Baltimore was a big city, and it was a pretty rough place back in the early 70s. I remember when I interviewed at Johns Hopkins Medical School for my internship. I ultimately went to Yale up in New Haven, and my wife and I drove from Ohio to the East Coast, and as we came into Baltimore and we drove towards the medical center, we got towards the hospital, and there was a chain link fence about 8 or 9 foot high with barbed wire over the top, encircling the whole hospital compound. And there were armed guards with German Shepherd dogs that were circling the perimeter of the hospital. And so my wife and I looked at each other and we said, I don't think we're going to be coming here. So I didn't go to Hopkins, and I went to Yale instead, which was good. But that gives you the idea about it at Baltimore. And so I decided around the end of 1971, I should look for a postdoc, and I found a postdoc up in Hanover, New Hampshire, and we went up there, and it was God's country. I mean, from a big city, it was just, green grass and pine trees, and the town was a Currier and Ives print of a New England college town with steeples and so forth. And we immediately decided this is where we should go. So I went there. I'll never forget the first day that I reported for duty, which is usually July 1st. In academic medicine, every July 1st, you sort of go on to your next gig, whatever that happened to be. And I sat down with my new mentor, and he said, well, there's good news and there's bad news. So the bad news is that I lost my grant, and we don't have enough money, really any money to speak of, to do any experiments this year. That sort of took the wind out of my sails. And he said, but the good news is I have money for your salary. So I was, I'd left the government lab where money was not an issue. Nobody even talked about money. I didn't even know, as a young, naive, budding scientist, that you had to worry about the money, because we never worried about it at the NIH. I mean, we just ordered stuff and they came, and then we did experiments, and when we ran out, we ordered more stuff. So this was a rude awakening for Kendall. And so I went home that night and told my wife Lynn the good news and the bad news. And I immediately sat down and wrote letters to looking for a second postdoc. Usually the postdocs were set up 2 years in advance, and they were for 2 years usually. And so, but I couldn't see myself cooling my heels up there in the middle of God's country without any experiments to do, because now I'd made my decision. I was not going to be a doctor. I was going to be a scientist, and I was eager to get on with it. Well, there were some things to do, and it's a long story. He had some monies through a cooperative chemotherapy group, and to do some clinical kinds of experiments. And so I helped him do that. So I sat down and wrote letters all over the place, and I always wanted to go to Europe. And so I wrote a lot of letters to Europe, and I got this position in Paris and accepted the position and so forth, because they would take me within 1 year. All the other people said, we're only looking at 2 years in advance. And so I had that. And so almost immediately I turned around, and I guess the moral of the story is you got to be quick on your feet. You can't just be lackadaisical about these kinds of things, and you have to take the matters into your own hands. And so what I did was, I made the best. I got a couple of papers out of that year, and I learned. So he was into interferon, and so I learned all about interferon and so forth. And at the time, I said to myself, well, if I'm going to go to Paris, I'd better learn how to speak French. And so I enrolled in the Dartmouth College's French 101 class, along with the freshmen. And when they found out, we went part of the early classes where they went around the room and said, well, how old are you? And I had to tell them that I was 30, and they all turned around and looked at me like I was from outer space. and that was a very humbling experience, because I learned that it's difficult to learn a foreign language, but I did the best I could. I studied very hard. And I also, when I was at Dartmouth, when the snows came, I enrolled in the Dartmouth phys ed class to learn how to ski. And so I learned how to ski, I learned French, and I learned about interferon. And so it wasn't a lost year, and I gained. And I think one of the things that I wanted to stress is that, in contrast, most people do a postdoctoral experience for 2 years, and then they move on to doing another one, and sometimes they do a third one. But I was in a hurry. I was in a big hurry, and because I run into this problem of the money situation at Dartmouth, I thought I'd better move out of here. And so the very next year I went to Paris. And so within 3 years, I did 3 different postdocs. What I learned during that time was I learned how 3 different labs did their thing. And I learned different techniques at each place. And so that was good, and that was enough. And as I said, I was in a big hurry. And so
why was that? What fueled that urgency at the time?
Well, it was just an innate desire to get on with it. And I felt as if, I had gone to meetings when I was down in Baltimore. I went to the very first International Immunology Congress, which was held in Washington, D.C. And it was for the first time I saw how big the field was. I mean, there were thousands of people there. I started getting a feeling for, what the business of this particular science was all about, and who the players were, and so forth. And so I started feeling that, if I'm going to do this whole thing, I'd better do it. And I also, because I'd made the decision that I didn't want to become a physician, even though I'd been trained to do that, and I could have just stopped this whole science business at any stage or any point, and then taken up my stethoscope and become in practice. To me, that would have been failure. I would have failed. I wasn't about to do that, essentially, so I burned my bridges behind me. And I only had one option at that stage of the game. I had to become successful, and so that's what was driving me, I think, at that stage of the game. And I could have been a practicing hematologist at Dartmouth, and maybe even done some lab work, a little bit of lab work, and so forth. And that's what Ross McIntyre was doing. So I could have become another Ross, but I stayed in an academic environment, and taught medical students and residents and so forth, and interns with a thing focused on patients. But also at that time, I'd also realized that, there was so much we didn't know about all the major diseases, cancer being the major one, and I was getting ready to become involved in cancer. And I knew that it was going to be a long, long time before there were any major breakthroughs to improve the clinical practice of cancer medicine at that stage. And so, all these things were sort of, meanwhile, my wife, we had 2 young boys, 2 toddlers that were growing up. One was born in 68, and the other one was born in 70, and this was only 71 or so, 72. So, and my wife was telling me, time for you to get a real job, for God's sakes, But anyway, I had secured this position over in France, and I'd always wanted to go to Europe, and particularly France. And so this seemed like a really good idea. And it was with Professor Georges Mattei, who is over my shoulder here. And this is him when he was around 50, which is the age he was when I went to work at his institute. And he was at the top of his game at that stage. And he was one of the pioneers of cancer immunotherapy. He had used this Bacillus calmette-guerin that I've talked about in some of the other videos to treat patients, usually children, with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he had published a paper in 1969 in The Lancet, which showed that if you first got the patients into complete remission with chemotherapy and wiped out most of their leukemia cells, then if you applied the BCG as an immunological boost, an adjuvant, they would have a prolonged disease-free interval where they were fine and they could go to work and go to school or whatever. They still ultimately then relapsed, but they relapsed much later than if they did not get this immunotherapy. So I went there in 1973, and just sort of parenthetically, that was right at the time when the Watergate. We left New York in June of 1973 when the Watergate hearings were just going bonkers. And I'll never forget, John Dean had just testified to Congress that there was a cancer in the presidency. And so basically, we felt really fortunate to be leaving the United States of America at that particular point in time.